It is the 18th of January 1871. In the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, was proclaimed German Emperor. This fulfilled a dream that German nationalists of all stripes had held for decades. The various German kingdoms, principalities, duchies and Hanseatic cities were finally united into a German empire under Prussian leadership. The path to this achievement was by no means easy, and it took 3 bloody and costly wars in quick succession before all obstacles were cleared. The man who made this possible was Otto von Bismarck, who had already demonstrated his extraordinary abilities and unique diplomatic skills as Prussian Prime Minister before being simultaneously appointed German Chancellor in 1871, a position he would hold for almost 20 years. However, the Germany he had created through iron and blood was by no means as united as he had initially hoped. It was a complicated hybrid between a confederation and a federal state, in which the respective princes enjoyed a great deal of independence. The southern German states in particular, such as Bavaria and Württemberg, were skeptical about the new empire and were traditionally Austria-leaning and keen to preserve their sovereignty. There was also political disagreement, and he had to rely on a fragile coalition that became increasingly strained over time. The Social Democrats and the newly founded Catholic Centre Party were skeptical about the new state and constitutional order. The left-liberal Progressive Party was in clear opposition to Bismarck. Even the Prussian ultra-conservatives rejected Bismarck's policies and resented his introduction of universal suffrage for men at the imperial level and his pragmatic power politics. The Reich Chancellor could only count on the support of the National Liberal Party and the Free Conservative Party, but certainly not unconditionally. Not even the population was truly united. This explicitly German nation-state was home to numerous national minorities. Poles and Lithuanians in eastern Prussia, Danes in Schleswig, and the French in Alsace-Lorraine. And finally, there was the religious disunity. Just like today, Germany in the late 19th century was a patchwork and very religiously diverse. The vast majority, a bit less than 2/3 of Germans, were Protestants, and on this map you can clearly see that they were mostly located in northern and central Germany. The strong Catholic minority was dominant in southern Bavaria, Baden and Alsace-Lorraine. Inside the Kingdom of Prussia, most Catholics lived in the Rhineland, the Saar area, Westphalia, Upper Silesia and Warmia. Areas with a strong Catholic presence included the Ruhr area, Lower Silesia, West Prussia, and the province of Posen. And it was precisely this Catholic minority that Bismarck decided to crack down on almost immediately after the founding of the empire. This led to a period of conflict between the Reich Chancellor and the Catholic Church, which had a decisive impact on the first decade of the German Empire. Bismarck bitterly attempted to curtail the influence of Catholics and weaken the Catholic Church. This endeavour was a huge failure, led to a strengthening of cohesion within the Catholic minority, and is considered one of Bismarck's greatest mistakes. This video is all about this conflict, which went down in history as the Kulturkampf, or Culture War in English. Why did Bismarck initiate the Kulturkampf? How did the Catholic Church respond? And what were the consequences? That is what we will be discussing today. First off, it's important to establish that the Kulturkampf wasn't an exclusively Prussian phenomenon. In the 19th century, a period marked by modernization and the emergence of strong central governments, most Western countries had to re-evaluate the role of the traditionally strong church within the political system. In the process, the secularized states, mostly characterized by enlightened liberalism, inevitably clashed with the power-conscious Catholic Church. Such disputes took place in the 1870s in Baden, Bavaria and Switzerland, for example. These conflicts can be traced back to a new kind of religious fundamentalism that originated in the Holy See in Rome. The main protagonist of this new cause was Pius IX, who was head of the Catholic Church from 1846 to 1878. During his long reign, Pius asserted his claim to global dominion and introduced a new dogmatization of Catholic doctrine. In December 1854, he brought back the cult of Mary by reading out a decree which declared Mary's freedom from original sin from the moment of her conception to be dogma. This put an end to a centuries-long dispute within the Catholic Church and declared that Mary, like Jesus Christ, had been free of original sin from birth. This deliberately created a romanticized counterpart to the increasingly rational industrial societies, which Pius absolutely detested. In 1864 he went a step further and published the Syllabus of Errors, an illiberal catalogue of 80 theses. In it he denounced the freedom of religion, the separation between state and church, the freedom of science, the freedom of speech, and just democracy as a whole. In order to consolidate the reactionary course of the Church and win over the highest clergy, the Pope held the First Vatican Council between 1869 and 1870. It was decided that faith always takes precedence over reason and that the Pope is infallible. With all these measures, Pius demonized all products of modernity and enlightenment and provoked a conflict with liberalism and secular states. This marked the birth of so-called ultramontanism, a papal-centric attitude within the Catholic clergy. The German liberals, who were mostly Protestant, were outraged. They had considered Germany to be a bulwark against papal irrationality. The Pope's new course seemed like a declaration of war against the forward-looking secular state. This became apparent when the Vatican began excommunicating Catholic German theologians in public service, such as professors, teachers, and military chaplains who opposed the papal decrees. Furthermore, the so-called Old Catholics split off from the Roman Catholic Church to protest against the First Vatican Council. A collision between state and church thus became inevitable. Ultimately, however, it would be Chancellor Otto von Bismarck who initiated the process of cutting back the power of the Catholic Church, and not the liberals. But why? As is always the case with Bismarck, there is no clear and straightforward answer. It is likely that several factors played a role in his decision-making process, and his motives changed over time. What is certain is that he did not wage the Kulturkampf for ideological reasons or to achieve a particular form of government. That would simply not have been in line with the Chancellor's character. Even though Bismarck quickly gained support from the liberals, their motives and ideas always differed. Bismarck's measures were primarily aimed at combating the Centre Party. It had been founded in 1870 as the Party of Political Catholicism and represented the interests of the Catholic Church. From the very beginning, Bismarck disliked this new party, which enjoyed great popularity among the Catholic minority and which he regarded as nothing more than the long arm of the Vatican. His suspicions were confirmed when, after the opening of the first parliamentary session in March 1871, the Centre Party requested that the Reichstag take action on the Roman question. The previous year, the Kingdom of Italy had annexed the remains of the Papal States, and now the Centre Party deputies symbolically demanded the restoration of the Pope's secular rule at the expense of Italy. In the debate on the future constitution of the empire just 1 month later, the Centre Party made its next blunder when it demanded that only the fundamental rights of the Church should be taken over from the Prussian constitution. In this way, the Centre contributed significantly to the outbreak of the Kulturkampf. Another reason for Bismarck's suspicion of Catholics was the Polish minority. The Chancellor considered the Polish clergymen in Posen and West Prussia to be agents of Polish nationalism and the carriers of Polonization. On top of that, Catholicism has always been one of the main pillars of Polish culture. On several occasions, Bismarck emphasized that the Polish question had been the main reason for the Kulturkampf. Now, the extent to which this is true is extremely controversial among historians. Such statements by Bismarck should be treated with extreme caution, as they were mostly made long after the conflict with the Catholic Church had been resolved. At this time, his aim was to restore relations between the state and German Catholics and to slowly seal old wounds. By discarding the role of the confrontative course of the Centre Party and the Pope, as well as his own actions, he could do just that. Even though the Polish question was certainly present in Bismarck's worldview, its significance for the launch of the Kulturkampf should not be overestimated. Bismarck was perfectly aware of the fact that there was no serious danger of separatist movements on the parts of the Polish clergy. Most Poles had come to terms with their lives as Prussian citizens, and even the hardline nationalists were no longer willing to plan further counterproductive armed uprisings that would only result in senseless deaths. And the final factor is that Bismarck had always held a very religiously influenced view of the German question. Already in the 1950s, during his time as envoy for Prussia in the Federal Convention in Frankfurt, he came to the conclusion that political Catholicism was the biggest threat for Prussia in southern Germany. He despised the increased Catholic piety with its demonstrative pilgrimages and public celebrations and the orientation towards Rome. At one point, he described Catholicism as hypocritical, idolatrous papism full of hatred and deceit. As time went on, he developed a sort of paranoia in regards to the abilities of the church to influence the opinions of the masses against him and the Protestant-dominated German Empire. Like I mentioned at the start, the empire created by Bismarck was an extremely divided entity, brought about by nearly a decade of war and diplomacy. Like many of his contemporaries, the Chancellor feared that Germany could fall apart just as quickly as it had been created if internal political division could not be overcome. And in Bismarck's eyes, Catholics were the biggest political opposition in the early 1870s and had to be brought into line at all costs. And so, the first step that Bismarck took was the dissolution of the Catholic section of the Ministry of Spiritual, Educational and Medical Affairs in 1871. It had been installed 30 years earlier and had represented Catholic interests. The immediate trigger for this were riots in Königshütte in Upper Silesia, a city which is known as Chorzów in modern Polish, was strongly Catholic and had a large Polish population. Bismarck used this as a pretext and blamed the Catholic department for the unrest. He was not at all concerned with Königshütte or the social circumstances that had triggered the riots, but rather with preparing his new anti-clerical course. If he wanted to bring about a new relation between state and church, he had to get the support of both Prussian parliaments. As such, he simply couldn't tolerate a Catholic section in a Prussian ministry that could get in his way. With that, the hurdle to Bismarck's fight against Catholicism was removed. In 1872, a new man became the leader of the Ministry of Spiritual, Educational and Medical Affairs, Adalbert Falk. Falk was a modest Protestant liberal from Lower Silesia and an admirer of Bismarck. He was to play an important role in Bismarck's measures against the Catholic Church and soon became the Chancellor's energetic assistant. He was enthusiastic about finally being able to reform the legal relationship between state and church and to create a secular society. At the same time, the conflict between the Vatican and the Prussian state had further intensified. The Pope refused to receive the newly appointed German envoy to the Vatican, Prince Gustav Adolf zu Hohenlohe-Schillingsfürst, due to his liberal views and opposition to papal infallibility. Shortly afterwards, 7 opposing professors in Bonn, Breslau and Braunschweig had their ecclesiastical teaching licenses revoked. One of them was even excommunicated. The state responded with a long series of restrictive laws. In December 1871, a law was introduced throughout the empire which made it illegal for clergymen to make political remarks in public. Anyone who broke that law could be punished with 2 years in prison. In March 1872, the School Supervision Act was enacted in Prussia. This placed all primary schools under state supervision. The law was a huge milestone for the liberals and it finally removed the influence of the clergy from education. In July of the same year, the Reichstag passed a law which banned the Jesuits in all of Germany, who were considered by many to be mere emissaries of the Vatican. Pope Pius reacted by making a call for resistance. Countless Catholics in Germany came together to voice their protests against the new laws, but to no avail. The conflict between state and church, the Kulturkampf, a term coined by the liberal politician Rudolf Virchow, was in full swing. What's interesting to note is that the Kulturkampf was very much carried by the liberal majorities in the Prussian parliament and in the Reichstag. They may not have shared the same goals as the Chancellor, but they were more than happy to finally crack down on the huge influence of the church in matters that, in their eyes, should only affect the state. This made them simultaneously Bismarck's instruments and eager driving forces behind the conflict. The conflict itself was escalated further with the introduction of the so-called May Laws by Adalbert Falk in 1873. These were a series of laws passed in Prussia, and they represented a heavy blow to the position of the Catholic Church. These laws made it obligatory for priests to get a degree in theology at any German university and to take an exam to test their knowledge of history, literature and philosophy. That way, the training of the clergy was put in the hands of the state, as long study visits to Rome were no longer feasible. The supreme presidents of the Prussian provinces were given the right to veto the employment of any clergyman they liked. Furthermore, a royal court was established in Berlin which dealt with church matters. Religious priests could thus simply be deposed. And finally, the May Laws limited the legal impact of excommunication and made it easier for people to formally leave the church. The bishops were outraged, and at a conference in Fulda in May 1873, they decided to refuse any participation in the new laws. Still, even more laws were introduced by the anti-clerical liberals and Bismarck in Prussia in the following years. Civil marriage became mandatory, priests who violated the May laws could be expatriated and expelled in serious cases, rebellious priests were now punished with heavy fines, and the Catholic press and associations were placed under strict surveillance. Later, civil marriage was extended to the whole of Germany, and all state benefits and subsidies for the church were blocked. On top of that, religious orders, especially those seen as politically active, were placed under intense scrutiny, and many were dissolved over time. So far, I've just given you an abstract list of laws that were passed in Prussia and in the German Empire. But what were the actual consequences for the people who were affected? The most obvious targets were the Catholic bishops, and by the end of the Kulturkampf, 5 out of 12 of Prussia's bishops had to serve a prison sentence. But the lower ranks were just as affected. Members of the common clergy who violated the May laws were arrested and punished with a hefty fine. If the clerics couldn't pay or simply refused to, as was often the case, they were sent to prison. Many spent days or even months in overcrowded, unsanitary prisons. Religious orders and monasteries in Prussia were affected as well, and many of them were closed down or dissolved. Around 2,000 nuns and monks had no choice but to seek a new life in the other German states or even abroad. Mere Catholic believers who stood up for the clergy were also persecuted. In August 1875, for example, 5 people received prison sentences for obstructing the closing of a cloister in Paderborn. In the first 4 months of 1875 alone, 210 Catholic lay people were convicted for refusing to cooperate with the authorities or for refusing to testify in court cases against the clergy. All in all, something between hundreds or thousands of Catholic lay people were arrested, fined or jailed for violating the law on peaceful assembly. In the Rhineland town of Stolberg, for example, 49 people were fined for forming a public procession to meet the Archbishop of Cologne. In another example, a couple of young men were fined in Münster for refusing a police order to evacuate the cathedral square. But the government didn't just infringe on religious but also on civil liberties. Particularly important were the oppositional newspapers, both Catholic and non-Catholic, who criticized the measures of the Kulturkampf. Now, because Germany enjoyed very liberal press laws which prohibited direct censorship, Bismarck and the government had to rely on other methods. They instead took away postal privileges, confiscated critical publications, had police arbitrarily search editorial offices, or fined as well as imprisoned critical editors. Bismarck particularly liked to employ the tactic of charging newspapers with slander. Actual or perceived insults against Bismarck, the Kaiser, or the Prussian state cabinet were prosecuted relentlessly, and many of the accused had to serve prison sentences. In one almost comical case, the chancellor complained against a Catholic newspaper that had failed to include the prefix Herr, which translates to Mr., when using the name Bismarck. In its effort to curb voices of dissent, the Prussian government also attempted to get rid of civil servants who were Catholic or were at least sympathetic to them. Civil servants in Catholic areas were constantly accused of being disloyal and of supporting the ultramontane cause. A report from the Prussian Interior Ministry claimed the following. In the Paderborn area, the greater part of the administrative personnel, county officials, mayors, policemen, local administrators, village leaders, as well as those magistrates appointed in an earlier period, even if they fulfill their official responsibilities, embrace pronounced ultramontane tendencies. As a result of this paranoia, the district governor of Arnsberg in Westphalia was forced to resign in 1875 because he didn't put enough effort into combating the ultramontanes. The same fate befell the supreme president of Silesia because he had allegedly been too lenient on the Prince-Bishop of Breslau. No other country in Europe took such radical and systematic action against Catholic institutions and clergy than Prussia. For almost a decade, the Prussian Catholics were put under almost constant strain. By the end of the Kulturkampf, nearly a quarter of all parishes were without pastors, as 1,800 priests had been imprisoned or forced into exile. The number of monastic houses was reduced by 1/3, and ordinary Catholics struggled to maintain the religious life they had been used to. Still, it needs to be said that full-scale violence was never employed, and throughout the entire Kulturkampf, not a single person lost their life at the hands of a Prussian policeman or a soldier. Rule of law still prevailed, and Prussian officials were reluctant to violate it. All in all, it is very interesting to observe that the anti-Catholic measures were nowhere near as rigorously executed as Bismarck would have wished, and the Catholic resistance proved to be too well organized to be overcome. Bismarck and his supporters made the old mistake of overestimating their abilities and underestimating those of their opponents. Most young priests simply refused to take part in the obligatory state exam and didn't bother to get a license to occupy a church office. The Catholic Church as a whole continued to illegally appoint priests as it wished. The sanctions and fines which the government then imposed were of absolutely no use, as the bishops just refused to pay. The Archbishop of Cologne, for example, amassed a total of 29,500 thaler in fines, which was twice his annual salary. In response, the local authorities confiscated the possessions of the bishops and sold them at public auctions. But even that turned out to be useless, as loyal Catholics came together to sabotage the auctions, buy the goods at a very low price, and then return them to the expropriated cleric. Prison sentences were also often useless, as high church dignitaries like bishops and archbishops were treated extremely well, accommodated in comfortable suites, allowed to bring the furniture from their palaces, and even given high-quality food. In one case, the judge put up a veto against the imprisonment of the elderly bishop of Kulm or Chełmno in West Prussia, arguing that the steps in the local prison were too steep. Expulsion became the Prussian state's last resort, but even that proved to be ineffective. Between 1875 and 1879, several hundred priests were expelled from their parishes. The district administrators, however, were completely unable to enforce the expulsion. In many cases, the expelled priests simply returned to their remote parishes without the authorities noticing. It also proved to be difficult to replace the expelled priests with reliable successors. The Catholic believers often ignored or despised the newcomers and demanded their old priest back. During this time of repression, the Catholic minority grew together and developed a feeling of solidarity. Passive resistance and disobedience towards the authorities became a widespread behavior. They showed full sympathies towards the clergy and demonstrably showed their distance towards the German nation-state by refusing to hoist the black, white and red flag on national holidays. A large social movement began to grow, and the Catholics became increasingly politicized. As a result, the Centre Party managed to drastically increase its share in votes. In the elections to the Prussian Parliament in 1873, the Centre Party grew from 52 to 90 seats. The same thing happened in the Reichstag elections in the following year, and the party grew from 63 to 91 seats. They gained most of their seats in Bavaria, the Rhineland and Upper Silesia, and were now on their way to become the first truly mass-based confessional party in Germany. But it was not only in political life that much changed, but also in spiritual life. A new popular religiosity emerged, which was explicitly directed against the Kulturkampf and secularization. This is best illustrated by a very peculiar event that took place in the late 1870s in the small village of Marpingen, not far away from Saarbrücken. In July 1876, three 8-year-old girls, Susanna, Katharina and Margareta, went into the local forest to gather some blueberries. As the evening dawned, they made their way back to the village through a large meadow. Then, suddenly, Susanna saw a female figure dressed in white holding a child. Katharina and Margareta saw her as well, and then the three of them rushed home, scared and confused, to tell the adults in the village about it. Susanna's mum believed them and told the girls to go back to the meadow on the next day and pray, as it could have been the Virgin Mary. That's exactly what they did, accompanied by 20 other children and 6 adults. And again, the vision appeared to Margareta and Katharina, and it told them, "I am the immaculately conceived one," before disappearing. On the next day, they repeated the procedure, but this time alongside a massive crowd of villagers who all came to see the phenomenon. That evening, Katharina's father, who had been suffering from rheumatism, was brought forth to put his hand where Mary's foot was supposed to be, according to the girls. Suddenly, the man felt healed and claimed that his illness was gone. Over the following days, some more miracles were performed, and more people began to claim that they saw the vision too. News spread quickly throughout the area, and people from the surrounding villages travelled to Marpingen for a chance to meet Mary. A bit more than a week after the first sighting, more than 20,000 pilgrims walked through this tiny village of 160 people. More and more Catholic Prussians flocked into Marpingen from Lorraine, the Rhineland and Westphalia, and soon all of Germany knew about this place. Among Catholic believers, there was no doubt that the sightings were genuine, while Protestants and atheists knocked them down as hallucinations or pipe dreams. The Catholic Church itself was equally skeptical, and after an investigation carried out in the late 1870s, Bishop Johannes Theodor Laurent came to the conclusion that the whole thing was just a hellish tomfoolery. And I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that the 3 girls didn't in fact see the Virgin Mary. On the evening of the first vision, the girls had been walking through the forest all day. They were tired, and the atmosphere of the sunset was a fitting environment. Furthermore, the girls had been exposed to the cult of Mary since they were born because the local priest was a glowing fanatic in that regard and often preached about the Immaculate Conception. At school they had been taught about the sightings of Mary at Lourdes and elsewhere. They all grew up in very religious families where the cult of Mary was never questioned. It is therefore likely that the girls recognized Mary from the numerous statues and holy images in their mind's eye when they saw what they saw that evening. Furthermore, the adults unquestioningly believed them and even asked suggestive questions to lead them into that direction. From that point on, the poor girls were under so much pressure that they simply had to go with it and claim to see the vision even if they didn't. They unwillingly set in motion a process that could no longer be stopped. The Prussian authorities were everything but pleased with the events in Marpingen. They suspected fraud, or even worse, a conspiracy made up by the Catholic clergy to rally its followers. There were even some voices who claimed that the whole affair was instigated by the French government to destabilize the German state. On the 13th of July, 80 soldiers arrived from the Prussian garrison at Saarlouis to disperse the pilgrims. When the group refused to do so and instead began to sing and pray, the soldiers were ordered to clear the area with violence. Several people were injured by blows from rifle butts or bayonet stabs. Afterwards, the soldiers stayed in Marpingen to keep the peace. In the following investigation, the local priest, the girls' parents, the mayor and the girls themselves were questioned. Margarete alone had to endure 12 interviews. In the end, the Prussian authorities found no evidence for a conspiracy and all of the accused were acquitted. Other than just being an interesting story, the episode at Marpingen reveals many characteristics of the Kulturkampf in concentrated form. You had the paranoia of the Prussian state, who genuinely couldn't fathom that the visions of Mary and the pilgrimages weren't some form of conspiracy, but just an expression of piety, faith or hope, as unreasonable as it may have been. Then you had the resistance of the believers who refused to dissolve the assembly and instead began to pray together. This shows that many Catholics were not willing to follow Prussian orders anymore. They felt alienated from this state that discriminated against them and resisted. The visions of Mary themselves can be considered an act of passive resistance. Many genuinely believed that Mary had finally arrived to stand by them. For the majority of Catholics in Prussia, the alleged appearances were a kind of consolation and encouraged them to hang on in the face of injustice. Before we talk about the end of the Kulturkampf, I want to discuss an aspect of it that often gets overlooked, namely its impact on the Polish minority. The Prussian Poles were overwhelmingly Catholic, and as such they were hit particularly hard by the introduced measures, especially seeing that the Catholic faith plays such a big role in Polish national identity. In Prussian Poland, the conflict against the church simultaneously became an anti-Polish struggle. This becomes particularly evident in school politics. As mentioned before, all primary schools were put under state supervision in 1872. As such, all the previous Polish teachers and inspectors, who were mostly priests as well, were replaced by Prussian state officials who spoke German instead. This was exacerbated by the fact that in the 1870s, a Germanization of the Prussian school system began to be pushed. In 1872, German became the sole language of teaching in all elementary schools in the province of Posen, in all subjects except religion and Polish. The use of Polish was very restricted in high schools, and in 1874 the Polish textbooks were outright forbidden. And even outside of schools, German became the sole language in administration and courts after 1876. But the conflict between the Prussian Poles and the state tightened with the imprisonment and expulsion of the Archbishop of Posen-Gnieźno, or Poznan-Gniezno, Mieczysław Leduchowski. Ironically, Leduchowski had been a loyal ally of the Prussian government for years and had always distanced himself from Polish nationalism. He forbade the singing of Polish nationalist songs in church masses and had absolutely no problem with the increased Germanization of public life. It was only when the rights of the church were infringed upon, at schools for example, that Leduchowski voiced his opposition. He was then imprisoned and exiled, which caused him to become a martyr, not just for the Catholic, but strangely also for the Polish cause as well. Hundreds of priests in his diocese who followed his example were arrested and 90 were removed from their parishes. The Kulturkampf had now created a common oppositional front between the Poles in West Prussia, Posen and Upper Silesia. The Centre Party thus gained a valuable ally in the Polish Reichstag faction to conduct the parliamentary fight. The alliance between the Centre and the Polish party served as confirmation for Bismarck in his assumptions that there was a conspiracy among Catholics to destroy the German Empire, his lifetime achievement. He accused the Poles of collaborating with the Vatican to bring back an independent Polish state. Kaiser Wilhelm I reports from one of the meetings he had with the chancellor. In his earlier conversation, Prince Bismarck had particularly emphasized that Prussia was seriously threatened by Russia and Austria via Poland, that the Catholics were united in a far-reaching alliance and were systematically agitating against Prussia. This conspiracy was of course just a product of Bismarck's fantasy, but it shows very clearly just how paranoid Bismarck was when it came to perceived enemies of the empire. The closing of the Catholic section of the Ministry of Spiritual, Educational and Medical Affairs in 1871 can be partially explained by the fact that Bismarck saw in it an agent of polonization. All in all, the Kulturkampf marked the beginning of a new era in the history of Prussian Poland. The stigmatization of Catholics caused the Polish people to suffer a painful loss of identity. Many members of the lower classes now began to distance themselves from the German nation and instead turned to Polish nationalist ideas. The population became increasingly united. However, this was only the beginning of a very long and ambivalent process that would drag on for decades and slowly alienated many Poles from the Prussian state. There are many reasons for why the Kulturkampf failed, and it certainly wasn't for a lack of trying on the part of the liberals. Instead, it was because of the fact that the state was never able to implement a consistent policy. As we've seen, the Catholics put up very clever and sometimes blunt forms of resistance that the state was simply not equipped to deal with. It lacked the administrative ability to fully implement all the laws it wished without resorting to violence. Furthermore, the unholy alliance between Bismarck and the liberals was only going to last this long. Both had very different goals, and thus the government couldn't use coordinated coercion to bring down Catholic opposition. Ultimately, Bismarck, all of his strong personal dislike for Catholicism aside, didn't lead the Kulturkampf for ideological reasons, but for political calculation. As such, when the opportunity presented himself, he had absolutely no problem changing his course. This happened in February 1878, when the reactionary Pope Pius IX, who had played a huge role in provoking the conflict and then became a public opponent of the Reich Chancellor, died of old age. His successor was Leo XIII, a moderate who wanted to settle the conflict. In May of the next year, Bismarck had a long discussion with Ludwig Windthorst, the leader of the Centre Party, and his personal opponent to discuss an end to the hostilities and perhaps future collaboration. Shortly after, Adalbert Falk asked to be dismissed. During a parliamentary beer evening, Bismarck announced, "The Kulturkampf is over. We will not continue it, and we will lay down our arms, but keep them well oiled." So why did Bismarck decide to change his course? The biggest and most obvious reason was that the Kulturkampf achieved none of his original goals. It didn't break the opposition of the Catholic Church, and it only made the Centre Party stronger than before. As such, the anti-Catholic policies proved to be completely counterproductive. Furthermore, the Kulturkampf was increasingly led by the liberals who attempted to push through their vision of a secular state. This was completely contrary to Bismarck's ideas, and the Chancellor repeatedly found himself forced to disregard his own political convictions. The fact that his change of heart came in 1878 was also no coincidence. The Reichstag elections of the previous year saw a shift to the right, as the conservative parties gained votes while the liberals lost quite a few. Bismarck hoped to create a conservative bloc and to oust the liberals from the government, but for that he needed the support of the Centre Party. On top of that, he had now spotted a new threat to the internal stability of the German Empire, the Social Democrats, and prepared a law which made them illegal. The centre was no longer of interest to him, and he unsuccessfully attempted to convince the party leaders to back up his anti-socialist fight. Over the course of the following years, most of the repressive anti-Catholic laws were repealed. The bishops were allowed to return, the state exam was abolished, and in April of 1887, Pope Leo formally drew a line under it all. Still, many of the laws remained in place, and they turned out to be very important steps in the secularization of German society, without which we could not imagine life today. As such, the Kulturkampf can also be considered a partial success of the liberal forces. Civil marriage stayed in place, and so did the state-controlled schools, the prohibition for priests to make remarks which threatened public life, and the obligation for the church to report the appointment of parishes to the state. Whether these undoubtedly important achievements could have been made without the bitterness and accompanying stigmatization of Catholics is another question. What can't be denied is that the Kulturkampf had long-lasting consequences. For one, the liberals suffered a big loss of credibility. They had tossed their principles overboard and entered an alliance with the Iron Chancellor. While liberals had long claimed to protect the rights of individuals from state arbitrariness, they were now guilty of doing exactly that. That's exactly what Windthorst pointed out in a speech in the Prussian parliament in 1876. Gentlemen, in the last 3 years, without even realizing it, you have completely abandoned your original liberal standpoint and are now nothing more than supporters of the government, a purely ministerial party that approves everything the minister demands. The Kulturkampf was also detrimental for the lives of Catholics in Germany. It damaged the domestic political climate, drove a deep wedge between the two Christian confessions, and marked Catholics as second-class citizens. This created wounds that took decades to heal. So to summarize, the Kulturkampf was an attempt by Bismarck to remove the Catholic Church as a political obstacle and to diminish the role of the Centre Party. This turned out to be a massive failure, and it only led to the Catholic minority growing together and developing a feeling of solidarity. Instead of winning over the Catholic minority and securing the stability of the empire that way, he excluded them and started a conflict. The Centre Party saw a massive increase in votes, and from 1881 onward, it remained the party with the most seats in the Reichstag for 3 decades. Bismarck had underestimated the abilities of his opponents and the damage that repressive politics could do. Ironically, it seems that he learned very little from his blunder, as he pushed a law through the Reichstag in 1878, which prohibited all socialist parties, including the Socialist Workers' Party. During the time of repression, the socialists only became more radical, and many members of the lower class began to vote for them. Once again, the tactic of employing the brute force of state power had failed. It's difficult to assess what the direct long-term consequences of the Kulturkampf were. Until the seizure of power of the National Socialists in 1933, the Centre Party remained a cornerstone of German parliamentary politics and played a huge importance in establishing Weimar democracy as well as abolishing it. They enjoyed the almost unconditional support of the Catholics in Bavaria, the Rhineland and Upper Silesia. The conflict surrounding the role the Church should play in state affairs was mostly put to an end peacefully by the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, established in 1919. The separation of state and church was now a part of the constitution and remains so to this day, even if this process hasn't in fact been fully resolved yet, as the church still plays a big role in contemporary politics in Germany. But I won't bore you with the details, as the video is long enough already. I'll leave you an article by Der Spiegel in the description if you want to learn a bit more. Alright then, Dankeschön for watching until the end. As you might think, making these videos is very difficult and time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier, a number of other sweet benefits. In any case, I want to thank my invaluable supporters, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Marius Gerling, Ian York, Leader Titan, Grünkohlfresser, Der Dicke Flipper, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, Philip Marchewka, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Wienweh, Pseudorizer, Lyle Furphy, Yin, William, Big Dave, Folling and Turdham Bone. Have a very pleasant day and see you next time.